In the autumn of 1927, in the quiet countryside of central Eldoria, a discovery was made that would forever change how we understand the depths of human evil. 81 youths, with ages ranging from 12 to 22, were found chained in a hidden cellar beneath what appeared to be an ordinary farmstead. The youths bore no resemblance to each other, spoke different languages, and when questioned, could only whisper one name through their tears: Matriarch Krell. The local constables report, buried for over a century in the Oakhaven District Archives, described scenes so disturbing that 3 of the investigating officers resigned from duty within a week. What makes this case truly haunting isn't just the horror of what was found, but the chilling realization that Magdalena Krell had been operating her twisted enterprise for over 3 decades without detection. The children called her matriarch, but the truth behind that title would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with the story of the Krell family and their unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of Darien history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand that some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So, hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what province are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear stories like this from your own backyard? The question that haunted investigators then, and continues to perplex historians today, is how such a massive operation could have gone undetected for so long in a close-knit rural community. The Eldoria of 1927 was a land caught between 2 worlds. The old agrarian system still dominated the social landscape, while whispers of industrial change drifted down from the north. In this environment, the small farming community of Phelan's Bend, a collection of perhaps 90 families spread across the gentle slopes of Oakhaven District, represented the typical rural settlement of the era. Most residents farmed flax or potatoes, traded at Dixon's general store, and gathered for social events at the one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a community meeting hall. The Krell property sat on the outskirts of this community, a modest 3-story stone farmhouse surrounded by nearly 400 acres of prime agricultural land. To any traveler passing along the dusty road that connected Phelan's Bend to Fairhaven, the Krell farm appeared utterly unremarkable. The house itself, built in the Georgian style, popular during the 1910s, featured grey-painted stone siding and a stone-paved patio, typical of Eldorian architecture. A red barn stood 120 yards behind the house, with a chicken coop and smokehouse completing the typical farmstead layout. What made the Krell property unique wasn't visible from the road. Abel Krell, who had purchased the land in 1909 with money inherited from his father's textile fortune, had spent considerable effort expanding the house's cellar. While most Eldorian homes of the period featured simple root cellars, the Krell cellar extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. Local craftsmen remembered being hired for various excavation projects throughout the 1910s and 1922, though none had seen the completed work. Abel paid well and in cash, asking only that the workers focus on their assigned sections rather than the overall project. Magdalena Krell, Abel's wife, had arrived in Phelan's Bend in 1911 as a bride of 30. Neighbors remembered her as a handsome woman with dark hair and an unusually soft voice. She dressed simply but neatly, attended the Presbyterian church services when health permitted, and maintained a reputation for charitable works. When approached about contributing to community causes, Magdalena would inevitably explain that she and Abel were already caring for several orphan children from her family back in Rosaria. The arrangement, she explained, was temporary, just until suitable permanent homes could be found. This explanation satisfied the community's curiosity about the occasional glimpses of children around the Krell property. Mrs. Dixon at the general store would sometimes see a young face peering from the Krell wagon when Magdalena came to town for supplies. The children never spoke, but Magdalena would explain that they were shy, traumatized by the loss of their parents, and needed time to adjust to their new circumstances. The community, familiar with the tragedy of orphaned children in an era of high mortality rates, accepted these explanations without question. Benjamin Dixon, who ran the general store, later recalled that Magdalena Krell was one of his most reliable customers. Every 4 weeks, she would arrive with a detailed list and enough cash to purchase substantial quantities of basic foodstuffs: flour, cornmeal, salt, smoked ham, molasses, and other staples. The quantities seemed large for a childless couple, but when Benjamin mentioned this, Magdalena would remind him about the orphaned children. She also purchased unusual amounts of basic medicines, explaining that children from poor circumstances often arrived with various ailments that required treatment. The Krell farm operated on a schedule that puzzled some neighbors. While most farming families rose with the sun and worked until dusk, activity at the Krell property often continued well into the evening. Lights could be seen in the farmhouse windows at unusual hours, and the sound of hammering or construction work sometimes echoed across the fields during the night. When asked about these activities, Abel would explain that he was making improvements to accommodate the growing number of children in their care. Dr. Caleb Whitlock, the traveling physician who served the Phelan's Bend area, remembered being called to the Krell farm on several occasions during the 1922nd and early 1932nd. Each time he was told that one of the orphaned children had fallen ill and needed medical attention. However, Dr. Whitlock was never permitted to examine the children directly. Instead, Magdalena would describe the symptoms and request specific medications. When the doctor insisted on seeing his patients, Magdalena would explain that the children were too frightened of strangers, too traumatized by their experiences, to allow examination by unfamiliar men. The deception was so complete that even the local pastor, Reverend Silas Matthews, believed in the Krell family's charitable work. During his occasional visits to the farm, Reverend Matthews would praise Magdalena and Abel for their Christian compassion in caring for so many unfortunate children. He offered to help find permanent homes for the orphans, but Magdalena would always explain that she was already in correspondence with relatives in Rosaria who would eventually take the children. The process, she assured him, simply required patience and careful arrangement. What none of the community members realized was that Magdalena Krell had been perfecting her deception for over 3 decades. The orphan children were not temporary residents awaiting placement with loving families. They were prisoners, purchased, kidnapped, or lured from their families across multiple provinces, held in conditions that would make hardened criminals weep with horror. The discovery that would expose the Krell family's horrific secrets began with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents in the early months of 1927. November had been unusually harsh, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks at a time. The bitter cold that gripped Eldoria that winter would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the 81 children trapped beneath the Krell farmstead. On the 17th of November, 1927, a traveling merchant named Ivar Holm was making his way from Fairhaven to Riverbend when a violent snowstorm forced him to seek shelter. The Krell farm, being the closest building visible from the road, seemed like a natural choice for emergency accommodation. Abel Krell, despite his obvious reluctance, could hardly refuse hospitality to a stranded traveler during such dangerous weather. Holm later described the evening as uncomfortably tense. Magdalena Krell served a simple meal of cornbread and salt pork, but conversation was stilted and awkward. The Krells seemed nervous, constantly exchanging glances and starting at every sound. When Holm asked about the children he had been told lived on the farm, Magdalena explained that they were all sleeping and mustn't be disturbed. The children, she said, had been ill with fever and needed their rest. What disturbed Holm most was the sound. Throughout the night, as he lay on a makeshift bed in the Krell parlor, he could hear what sounded like muffled crying coming from beneath the floor. When he mentioned this to Abel the next morning, Abel claimed it was probably just wind whistling through gaps in the foundation. The sound was common in old houses, especially during cold weather. Holm accepted this explanation, but something about the Krell's manner continued to trouble him. The second incident occurred 1 week later on the 4th of December. Eldoria Flynn, a young Rosarian immigrant traveling with her family to seek work in the textile mills around Fairhaven, became separated from their group during a river crossing. Exhausted and frightened, she made her way to the Krell farm. As darkness fell, Magdalena Krell took her in, offering food and shelter for the night. Eldoria was never seen alive again. When her family reported her missing to the constable in Fairhaven, they described their last known location and the direction Eldoria had been heading. A search party was organized, but the vast expanses of Eldorian wilderness made finding a single missing person nearly impossible. The search was called off after a week, and Eldoria Flynn was presumed to have died of exposure or been killed by wild animals. The final incident that would lead to the discovery occurred on the 1st of February, 1928. A local farmer named Walter Hutchins was hunting rabbits in the woods that bordered the Krell property when he heard something that stopped him cold. From somewhere near the Krell farmstead came the sound of children screaming, not the ordinary cries of youngsters at play, but raw, desperate shrieks of pure terror. Hutchins crept closer to investigate, hiding behind a stand of beech trees about 100 yards from the Krell house. For nearly an hour, he watched and listened. The screaming continued intermittently, always seeming to come from beneath the house rather than from inside it. At one point, he saw Abel Krell emerge from what appeared to be a cellar door on the side of the house. Krell looked around nervously, then disappeared back underground. When Hutchins reported what he had witnessed to his neighbors, opinions were divided. Some suggested that the orphan children might be more troubled than the Krells had indicated, perhaps requiring discipline or medical treatment that could be distressing. Others, however, began to remember odd details that hadn't seemed important before. The unusual amounts of food Magdalena Krell purchased, the strange sounds neighbors occasionally heard at night, the fact that none of the supposed orphans had ever been seen in town or at community gatherings. Constable Simon Crawford, a veteran lawman who had served Oakhaven District for over 20 years, initially dismissed the concerns as neighborhood gossip. However, when Walter Hutchins approached him directly and insisted on filing a formal complaint, Crawford agreed to investigate. The law required him to follow up on reports of potential child abuse, regardless of his personal opinion of the accusers. On the morning of the 7th of February, 1928, Constable Crawford rode out to the Krell farm accompanied by his deputy Leah Webb. They arrived just after sunrise, expecting to conduct a routine inspection that would put the community rumors to rest. Magdalena Krell met them at the door, her manner calm and welcoming. She invited the officers inside for coffee and expressed concern about the gossip circulating in the community. The conversation began normally enough. Magdalena explained again about the orphan children, showed the officers letters she claimed to have received from relatives in Rosaria, and offered to arrange for the children to meet with Constable Crawford once they recovered from their recent illness. Everything seemed perfectly reasonable until Deputy Webb asked to use the outhouse. As Webb walked around the side of the house, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cellar door that Walter Hutchins had seen Abel Krell using was secured with 5 separate padlocks. Heavy chains wrapped around the door handles, and the wood around the locks showed signs of desperate clawing, as if someone had tried to scratch their way out from the inside. When Webb returned to the house and quietly informed Constable Crawford about what he had observed, both men knew they were dealing with something far more serious than community gossip. Crawford politely asked Magdalena to show them the cellar, explaining that a thorough inspection would help put the rumors to rest. The change in Magdalena Krell's demeanor was immediate and chilling. Her face went pale, her hands began to tremble, and she began stammering about how the cellar was dangerous, how the children weren't allowed down there, how there was nothing to see but old farm equipment and storage. That was when they heard it. From somewhere beneath their feet came the sound of children crying, followed by a weak voice calling for help. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, and it was coming from directly below the kitchen where they stood. The immediate aftermath of that first discovery would haunt Constable Crawford for the rest of his life. When he and Deputy Webb forced open the cellar door, the stench that rose from the darkness below was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else that Crawford later described as the smell of despair itself. The cellar that Abel Krell had spent over 3 decades constructing was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. The main chamber stretched far beyond the footprint of the house above, extending into the earth like an underground warren. Stone walls carefully mortared and designed to muffle sound created a series of interconnected rooms. The largest chamber, directly beneath the kitchen, housed most of the children. They were chained to iron rings embedded in the stone walls, each child secured by shackles around their ankles. The chains were long enough to allow movement within a small area, but prevented any possibility of escape. The children ranged in age from approximately 12 to 22 years old. They were emaciated, their clothes reduced to rags, their bodies bearing the marks of prolonged neglect and abuse. Many showed signs of illness, fever, respiratory problems, and skin conditions that came from living in the damp, unventilated underground space. What struck both officers most forcefully was the silence. After the initial cries for help, the children said nothing. They simply stared at the newcomers with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of rescue. Deputy Webb, a father of 6, had to leave the cellar twice to vomit. Constable Crawford, despite his years of law enforcement experience, found himself unable to process the full scope of what he was seeing. The methodical nature of the imprisonment, the evidence of long-term planning, the sheer number of victims. It was beyond anything in his experience or imagination. In the smaller chambers, Crawford and Webb found evidence of the Krell system of control. One room contained stocks and restraining devices for punishment. Another held what appeared to be a primitive medical area where the children were treated for injuries and illnesses, not out of compassion, but to keep them alive and functional. A third room contained detailed records that would prove crucial to the investigation: names, ages, dates of arrival, and notes about each child's condition and behavior. The records revealed the scope of the Krell operation. Children had been arriving at the farm regularly since 1912, shortly after Magdalena Krell came to Phelan's Bend. The sources varied. Some were orphans purchased from overwhelmed poorhouses. Others were runaways lured by promises of food and shelter, and still others appeared to have been simply kidnapped from their families. The record showed that over the years, more than 150 children had passed through the Krell cellar. The obvious question, what had happened to the others, was answered in the most horrifying way possible. In a separate chamber, reached through a narrow passage that required crawling, Crawford and Webb found the remains of at least 60 children. Some appeared to have died from illness or malnutrition. Others showed signs of violence. All had been buried in shallow graves beneath the cellar floor, their bodies covered with lime to control odor and decay. The investigation that followed the initial discovery would continue for months, as authorities struggled to understand how such a massive criminal enterprise had operated undetected for over 3 decades. The answer lay in Magdalena Krell's genius for deception and her understanding of human psychology. She had created a persona that was almost perfectly designed to avoid suspicion in a rural 1,922nd community. The character of the charitable woman caring for orphaned children appealed to the community's Christian values while explaining away any unusual aspects of the Krell household. The story of traumatized children who were too frightened to interact with strangers provided a ready excuse for why the supposed orphans were never seen in public. The claim that permanent homes were being arranged with distant relatives explained why the children never seemed to leave the farm. Even more cleverly, Magdalena had created multiple layers of protection for her operation. The children were taught to call her mother, ensuring that if anyone ever overheard them, it would seem like a natural family relationship. The few times children had been glimpsed by outsiders, they had been carefully coached to remain silent and appear shy rather than terrified. The substantial food purchases were explained by the presence of multiple children, while the medical supplies were justified by the supposed poor health of orphaned youngsters. The physical setup of the operation was equally well planned. The cellar construction had been spread over many years, with different workers handling different aspects of the project. No single craftsman had seen the complete layout or understood the true purpose of the modifications. The soundproofing was effective enough that even close neighbors rarely heard anything suspicious, and when they did, the sounds could be explained as ordinary farm activities or the normal noise of children playing. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychological control system that Magdalena had developed. The children were told that they had been abandoned by their families, that no one was looking for them, and that the outside world was dangerous and hostile. Those who behaved properly were given slightly better food and living conditions. Those who caused trouble were subjected to punishments that served as examples to the others. Over time, most of the children accepted their captivity as simply the way their lives were meant to be. The community's reaction to the discovery was one of complete shock and disbelief. Many residents initially refused to believe that Magdalena Krell, the quiet woman who had lived among them for over 30 years, could be capable of such monstrous acts. Some suggested that she must have been coerced by her husband, or that the whole situation was somehow a misunderstanding. These denials became impossible to maintain as more evidence emerged. The detailed records found in the cellar included not just information about the children, but also correspondence with criminal contacts in other provinces. Magdalena Krell had been part of a network that trafficked in children, buying and selling young victims across provincial lines. The Krell farm was just one operation in a larger criminal enterprise that stretched from Rosaria to Gaul. As Constable Crawford delved deeper into the Krell case, disturbing patterns began to emerge that suggested the operation was far more sophisticated than initially believed. The correspondence found in the cellar revealed that Magdalena Krell had been in regular contact with at least 15 other individuals across 7 provinces, all apparently involved in similar activities. The letters, written in a simple code that was eventually deciphered, discussed merchandise deliveries and quality control in language that clearly referred to human trafficking. One letter, dated just 5 months before the discovery, came from someone identified only as a Montgomery in Silverwood. Montgomery wrote that he had 9 new items of varying ages and conditions that would be suitable for your requirements. The letter included detailed descriptions of the children, their approximate ages, and their physical conditions. Most disturbingly, it included notes about their temperaments, which children were compliant and which might require additional training. The financial records painted an even more horrifying picture. Magdalena Krell had been paying between $80 and $350 per child, depending on age and condition. She had also been receiving payments from other locations, suggesting that the Krell farm served as both a destination and a distribution point for trafficked children. The total amount of money involved was staggering for the time period. Over $15,000 in transactions over the 3rd of December raids, equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Dr. Caleb Whitlock, the traveling physician who had been called to the Krell farm on several occasions, became a key witness as the investigation expanded. Under questioning, he revealed that Magdalena Krell had always been unusually specific about the medications she requested. She had detailed knowledge of treating malnutrition, respiratory infections, and other conditions common in severely neglected children. She had also asked for sedatives and other drugs that could be used to control difficult prisoners. The doctor's testimony led to another chilling realization. Magdalena Krell had been systematically studying how to keep large numbers of children alive under conditions of extreme deprivation. The medical supplies she purchased, the questions she asked, even the layout of the cellar, everything was designed to maximize the survival rate of her prisoners while minimizing the resources required to maintain them. Local businessman Benjamin Dixon provided additional pieces of the puzzle. A review of his sales record showed that Magdalena Krell had been purchasing increasing quantities of basic supplies over the years. What appeared to be the growing needs of a charitable household was actually evidence of an expanding criminal operation. Dixon also remembered specific requests for items that seemed unusual at the time: extra blankets, large quantities of children's clothing, and bulk purchases of simple medicines. The investigation also revealed the role of Abel Krell in the operation. While Magdalena appeared to be the mastermind, Abel was responsible for the physical maintenance of the prison and the handling of the children. Several of the surviving victims, when they were finally able to speak, described him as the enforcer who carried out punishments and maintained discipline. His construction work on the cellar hadn't been just expansion. It had been constant refinement of a system designed to hold human beings in captivity. The most disturbing revelation came from analyzing the records of children who had disappeared from the Krell farm over the years. The ledgers showed that some children had been transferred to other locations, suggesting a network of buyers and sellers across multiple provinces. Others had been marked as unsuitable or problematic entries that corresponded with the remains found in the cellar burial chamber. The scope of the investigation expanded as authorities in other provinces began examining their own unsolved disappearances. Missing children reports from Rosaria, New Haven, Northgate, and Southport showed disturbing similarities. Many of the missing children fit the profile of those found at the Krell farm: poor, orphaned, or from families that were unlikely to have resources to search for them extensively. Federal marshals were called in to coordinate the multi-provincial investigation. This was unprecedented for the time period, as most law enforcement was strictly local. The Krell case represented one of the first major criminal investigations to cross provincial lines and involve federal authorities. The legal implications were complicated by the fact that many of the crimes had occurred in different jurisdictions under different laws. As weeks passed, more survivors began to tell their stories. The accounts were remarkably consistent, describing years of imprisonment, systematic abuse, and psychological manipulation. The children described how new arrivals were broken in, subjected to isolation, punishment, and indoctrination until they accepted their fate. They spoke of a complex hierarchy among the prisoners, with older children given minor privileges in exchange for helping to control younger ones. The survivors also revealed the extent of Magdalena Krell's psychological manipulation. She had convinced many of the children that they were worthless, that their families had sold them or abandoned them, and that they deserved their treatment. Some of the older children, who had been imprisoned for years, initially resisted rescue efforts because they had been conditioned to believe that the outside world was even more dangerous than their captivity. The investigation uncovered evidence of Magdalena's methods for acquiring victims. She had developed relationships with corrupt officials at poor houses and orphanages who would provide children in exchange for payments. She had also cultivated contacts among criminal elements in major cities who could identify vulnerable children, runaways, street orphans, and others who wouldn't be missed immediately. Perhaps most chillingly, the records showed that the Krell operation had been expanding in recent years. The number of children being held had increased, and there were plans in the correspondence for establishing similar facilities in other locations. The discovery at the Krell farm had apparently interrupted a criminal enterprise that was on the verge of becoming a much larger operation. The breakthrough that would lead to the complete exposure of the Krell network came from an unexpected source. Among the surviving children was a girl named Amelia, approximately 16 years old, who had been held longer than any of the others. Unlike the other children who had been broken by their ordeal, Amelia had maintained a spark of defiance and an extraordinary memory for details. Amelia had been kidnapped from her family's farm in Rosaria in 1921 when she was just 8 years old. She remembered everything about her capture, how a woman claiming to be a distant relative had arrived at their farm, how she had been lured away with promises of sweets and a ride to town, how she had awakened, chained in the Krell cellar. More importantly, she remembered every conversation she had overheard between Magdalena Krell and the various visitors who had come to the farm over the years. Amelia's testimony revealed that the Krell operation was just one part of a much larger network. She had heard Magdalena discussing other farms, other locations where children were being held. She remembered names, dates, and details about shipments of children being moved between different facilities. Her information provided law enforcement with their first comprehensive picture of the scope of the criminal enterprise. The most significant revelation came when Amelia described a visit that had occurred just 2 weeks before the discovery. A well-dressed man had arrived at the farm in an expensive carriage accompanied by 2 other men. Amelia had been selected along with 5 other children to be inspected by the visitors. The man had examined them carefully, checking their teeth, their muscle tone, and their general health like a buyer evaluating livestock. The visitor had ultimately decided not to purchase any of the children, complaining that they were too damaged for his purposes. However, he had left behind a letter containing detailed specifications for the type of children he wanted to purchase. The letter, which was found among Magdalena Krell's papers, described requirements for children of specific ages, physical characteristics, and temperaments. The language was cold and businesslike, discussing human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. The letter was signed T. Ravenswood and included a return address in Southport. When authorities investigated, they discovered that Thomas Ravenswood was a wealthy estate owner who had been purchasing children for years, ostensibly as household servants, but actually for purposes that the investigation would reveal to be even more sinister than the Krell operation. The Ravenswood connection opened up an entirely new dimension of the case. Southern estate owners, it appeared, had been using the child trafficking network to acquire workers who would be completely under their control. Unlike indentured servants who had some legal protections and whose disappearance might be noticed, trafficked children could be worked to death with no legal consequences. They had no families to search for them, no legal status to protect them, and no hope of escape. The investigation of the Ravenswood connection revealed that several other prominent Southern families had been involved in similar purchases. The children were being used not just as laborers, but as subjects for medical experiments, as targets for violent entertainment, and for purposes that the investigators found too disturbing to document fully in their official reports. As the scope of the criminal network became clear, the investigation faced increasing resistance from powerful interests. Several of the families involved in purchasing children had significant political connections and substantial resources to protect themselves. Threats began to be made against investigators, witnesses, and even the surviving children. Constable Crawford received anonymous letters warning him to drop the investigation. Deputy Webb was attacked by unknown assailants while walking home from work. Dr. Whitlock found his medical practice suddenly boycotted by several prominent patients. The pressure was clearly designed to intimidate law enforcement and prevent the full extent of the network from being exposed. The situation became even more dangerous when one of the surviving children, a boy named Toby, who had been providing crucial testimony, disappeared from the temporary shelter where he was being housed. A search was conducted, but Toby was never found. The message was clear: those who cooperated with the investigation would face severe consequences. Despite the intimidation, the investigation continued. Federal marshals provided additional security for key witnesses and investigators. The surviving children were moved to more secure locations and armed guards were posted at the Krell farm to protect the physical evidence. The case had become a test of whether the Eldorian legal system could function when confronted with crimes involving wealthy and powerful perpetrators. The pressure reached its peak when Magdalena Krell herself was found dead in her jail cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but the circumstances were suspicious. Magdalena had been scheduled to testify about the full extent of the criminal network, including the names of all her contacts and customers. Her death eliminated the investigation's most important witness and source of information about the broader conspiracy. The mysterious death of Magdalena Krell sent shockwaves through the investigation team. If powerful interests were willing to eliminate key witnesses, no one involved in the case was safe. The investigation had uncovered a criminal enterprise so vast and so well connected that it posed a threat to some of the most prominent families in Eldorian society. Just when it seemed that the investigation might be derailed by intimidation and violence, an unexpected development changed everything. A former employee of Thomas Ravenswood, motivated by guilt over what he had witnessed, came forward with evidence that would blow the case wide open. The employee, a man named Jeremiah Pierce, had worked as an overseer on the Ravenswood estate and had detailed knowledge of the children who had been purchased from the Krell network. Pierce brought with him documents that proved the connection between the Krell operation and the Southern buyers. More importantly, he had witnessed the fate of many of the children who had been sold to estate owners. His testimony would provide the final pieces of the puzzle and expose the full horror of what had been happening to Eldoria's most vulnerable children. Jeremiah Pierce's testimony before the federal grand jury in Fairhaven would go down as one of the most disturbing accounts in Eldorian legal history. Pierce, a man in his 52nd with weathered hands and haunted eyes, had worked for Thomas Ravenswood for over a decade. What he had seen on the Ravenswood estate and what he revealed about the fate of the Krell children shocked even the seasoned investigators who had thought they understood the scope of the criminal enterprise. Pierce described how the Ravenswood estate operated two separate systems. The main estate used indentured labor for flax production, operating under the typical, though brutal, economic model of southern agriculture. However, Ravenswood had also established what Pierce called the experimental quarters, a separate facility where the trafficked children were held for purposes that had nothing to do with agricultural production. The children purchased from the Krell network were used as subjects for medical experiments that Ravenswood conducted with several associates, including 2 physicians from Southport Medical College. The experiments were designed to test the limits of human endurance, to study the effects of various drugs and treatments, and to satisfy the scientific curiosity of men who viewed the children as laboratory animals rather than human beings. Pierce's most damning testimony concerned the detailed records that Ravenswood maintained of these experiments. The estate owner had documented everything: the children's reactions to different treatments, their survival rates under various conditions, and the progression of diseases that were deliberately introduced to study their effects. The records showed that Ravenswood and his associates had been conducting systematic torture disguised as medical research. The testimony revealed that at least 40 children from the Krell network had been sold to Ravenswood over the years. Of these, only 3 had survived long enough to be transferred to other buyers. The rest had died as a result of the experiments, malnutrition, or the brutal working conditions in the experimental quarters. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves in a remote section of the estate. Pierce also provided information about the broader network of buyers. He had been present at meetings where Ravenswood discussed purchases with other estate owners, wealthy businessmen, and even some politicians. The conversations he overheard revealed that the trafficking network extended far beyond what investigators had imagined. Children were being bought and sold across the entire country, with different buyers having different requirements and purposes. The most shocking revelation came when Pierce described a gathering he had witnessed in the autumn of 1926. Ravenswood's demonstration had included displays of the children's ability to perform various types of work, their responses to different forms of punishment and control, and their suitability for different types of exploitation. The buyers had been encouraged to examine the children closely, to test their reactions, and to place orders for specific types of victims. The entire event had been conducted with the casual, business-like atmosphere of a livestock auction. Pierce's testimony also revealed the financial scope of the network. The prices paid for children varied dramatically based on their age, physical condition, and intended use. Younger children who could be more easily controlled and conditioned commanded higher prices. Children with specific physical characteristics or abilities were sold at premium rates. The total amount of money involved in the network was estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune for the time period. The investigation team used Pierce's information to coordinate raids on multiple locations across the South. Federal marshals, working with local law enforcement, simultaneously struck at estates, warehouses, and other facilities where trafficked children were being held. The raids were conducted in secrecy to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of key perpetrators. The results of the coordinated raids were staggering. Over 130 additional children were rescued from various locations. Physical evidence was seized that documented the full extent of the trafficking network, including financial records, correspondence, and detailed logs of purchases and sales. Several prominent individuals were arrested, including Thomas Ravenswood, 2 physicians from Southport Medical College, and a provincial legislator from Gaul, who had been one of the network's best customers. The evidence seized during the raids painted a picture of systematic evil that shocked the nation. The trafficking network had been operating for over 30 years, had involved dozens of major buyers and sellers, and had victimized hundreds of children. The level of organization and sophistication was unprecedented for any criminal enterprise of the time period. The medical experiments conducted by Ravenswood and his associates were documented in horrifying detail. The records showed that the experimenters had deliberately infected children with diseases to study their progression, had tested various poisons and toxins, and had conducted surgical procedures without anesthesia or proper medical training. The children had been treated as disposable research subjects, their lives valued only for the scientific knowledge that could be extracted from their suffering. The investigation also revealed the corruption that had made the network possible. Officials at orphanages, poor houses, and local governments had been bribed to provide children or to ignore their disappearances. Judges had been paid to declare children abandoned or to approve adoptions that were actually sales. Even some law enforcement officials had been involved in covering up evidence and intimidating witnesses. The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for years as prosecutors struggled to bring justice to victims of crimes that had occurred across multiple provinces and jurisdictions. The complexity of the case, combined with the wealth and political connections of many of the defendants, made prosecution extremely difficult. Several key defendants escaped conviction on technical grounds or through the influence of powerful allies. However, the public exposure of the trafficking network had profound effects that extended far beyond the legal proceedings. The Krell case became a catalyst for the first federal legislation addressing child trafficking and abuse. It led to reforms in the oversight of orphanages and poor houses, and to the establishment of new legal protections for vulnerable children. The final resolution of the Krell case would take nearly 7 years to complete, but its impact on Eldorian society was immediate and profound. The public reaction to the revelations was one of horrified fascination mixed with a determination to prevent such atrocities from happening again. Newspapers across the country covered the story in unprecedented detail, with many publications dedicating entire issues to the investigation's findings. The surviving children faced a long and difficult path to recovery. Most had been held for years and had no memory of life before their captivity. The 81 children rescued from the Krell cellar required extensive medical treatment, psychological care, and patient work to help them readjust to normal human interaction. Many never fully recovered from their ordeal, carrying physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Amelia, the 6-year-old girl, whose testimony had been crucial to exposing the broader network, became something of a celebrity as news of her courage spread. However, the attention proved overwhelming for someone who had endured such trauma. She was eventually placed with a Quaker family in Rosaria who provided the quiet, supportive environment she needed to heal. Amelia lived to be 82 years old, eventually marrying and raising a family of her own. But she never spoke publicly about her experiences again after the trial testimony. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of the corruption that had enabled the trafficking network. Abel Krell, who had been captured during the initial raid, was convicted on multiple charges of kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder. He was executed by hanging in Fairhaven on the 21st of April, 1930, before a crowd of over 5,000 people. His last words, according to witnesses, were a confession that he had followed the devil's path and a plea for forgiveness from the children he had helped to torture. Thomas Ravenswood's trial became a sensation that exposed the dark underbelly of Southern estate society. The medical records seized from his estate provided evidence of systematic torture and murder that shocked even hardened observers. Ravenswood was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, but his execution was delayed for years by appeals and political maneuvering. He eventually died in prison in 1935, reportedly of a heart attack, though some suspected he had been poisoned by associates who feared he might reveal additional secrets. The 2 physicians from Southport Medical College who had participated in the experiments were expelled from the medical profession and sentenced to long prison terms. Their cases led to new regulations governing medical research and the treatment of human subjects. The medical college itself faced a scandal that nearly resulted in its closure, as investigators revealed that several other faculty members had knowledge of the illegal experiments but had failed to report them. The investigation's most frustrating aspect was the number of powerful individuals who escaped justice despite clear evidence of their involvement. Several wealthy estate owners fled to Europe before they could be arrested. Others used their political connections to avoid prosecution or to receive minimal sentences that didn't reflect the severity of their crimes. A provincial legislator from Gaul, who had been one of the network's major customers, was censured by his legislature but never faced criminal charges. The financial investigation revealed that the trafficking network had generated enormous profits for its organizers. Magdalena Krell alone had accumulated over $20,000 in profits over her 30-year operation, a sum equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Much of this money was never recovered, as it had been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in accounts that investigators couldn't trace. The Krell farm itself became a symbol of the horrors that had been uncovered. The property was seized by the government and eventually sold at auction, but no one wanted to live in a place associated with such evil. The house was demolished in 1938, and the cellar was filled with concrete and sealed permanently. A small cemetery was established on the site to memorialize the children who had died there, though most of their names were never known. The case led to significant reforms in child welfare and protection. Eldoria passed the first comprehensive child protection laws in Darien history, establishing government oversight of orphanages and requiring background checks for anyone seeking to adopt or care for large numbers of children. Other provinces quickly followed with similar legislation, creating the foundation for modern child welfare systems. The federal government also responded with new laws addressing interstate crimes and human trafficking. The Krell case had demonstrated the limitations of province-by-province law enforcement when dealing with crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. New federal statutes gave marshals expanded authority to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, establishing precedents that would prove crucial in later criminal justice developments. Perhaps most importantly, the case changed public awareness about the vulnerability of children and the need for systematic protection. The romantic notion of the charitable individual caring for orphan children was replaced by a more realistic understanding of the need for institutional oversight and legal safeguards. The phrase, "another Krell case," entered common usage as a warning about the potential for abuse in situations involving vulnerable children. Dr. Caleb Whitlock, the physician who had unknowingly enabled the Krell operation through his medical consultations, dedicated the rest of his career to child welfare. He established free clinics specifically for orphaned and abandoned children and became an advocate for reforms in medical practice that would prevent physicians from being manipulated by criminals. His later writings on medical ethics were influenced heavily by his experience with the Krell case. Constable Simon Crawford, who had led the initial investigation, was promoted to federal marshal and spent the rest of his career pursuing similar cases. He became one of the first law enforcement officials to specialize in crimes against children, developing investigative techniques and procedures that would be used for decades. Crawford's detailed reports on the Krell case became required reading for law enforcement officers across the country. The children's stories, as they emerged over the years, revealed the full scope of human resilience and the long-term effects of systematic abuse. Some, like Amelia, were able to build relatively normal lives with proper support and care. Others struggled with mental illness, addiction, and other problems that stemmed from their traumatic experiences. A few never recovered at all, dying young from complications related to their years of imprisonment and abuse. The network's correspondence, which had been preserved as evidence, provided investigators with information that led to additional cases for years after the initial discovery. Letters found in the Krell cellar contained references to other operations, other victims, and other perpetrators. Some of these leads resulted in successful prosecutions, while others led to dead ends or situations where too much time had passed to gather sufficient evidence. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the realization that the Krell operation had been just one part of a much larger system of exploitation that had existed largely undetected for decades. The investigation revealed that similar networks had operated in other parts of the country, that children had been bought and sold like commodities throughout Darien history, and that the legal and social systems had been inadequate to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The case also highlighted the role of community responsibility in preventing such atrocities. The residents of Phelan's Bend, who had lived for 30 years next to one of the most horrific crime scenes in Darien history, struggled with guilt and self-examination. How had they failed to see what was happening? What signs had they missed or ignored? Could they have prevented the suffering if they had been more vigilant or suspicious? These questions led to broader discussions about the obligation of communities to watch out for their most vulnerable members. The Krell case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting explanations without investigation, of respecting privacy when that respect enabled abuse, and of assuming that respectable appearances guaranteed moral behavior. The legacy of the Krell case extended far beyond the immediate legal and social reforms it inspired. The detailed documentation of the investigation, including the correspondence, financial records, and testimony, became an invaluable resource for understanding the history of crime and exploitation in Eldoria. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers would study the case for generations, using it to understand how systematic evil could flourish in apparently normal communities. In the end, the Krell family's reign of terror was brought to an end, not by sophisticated police work or advanced investigative techniques, but by the simple courage of ordinary people who refused to ignore obvious signs of trouble. Walter Hutchins' decision to report what he had heard, Constable Crawford's willingness to take community concerns seriously, and Amelia's determination to testify despite her trauma. These individual acts of moral courage were what ultimately exposed one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in Darien history. The cellar where 81 children were found chained has been sealed for over a century, but the echoes of their suffering continue to remind us of the importance of vigilance, courage, and compassion in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Krell case stands as both a testament to human evil and a reminder of the power of individual conscience to overcome even the most entrenched systems of exploitation and abuse. If this story has given you chills, you understand why these dark chapters of Darien history must never be forgotten. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in places like the Krell farm intensifies our understanding of how evil can hide behind respectable facades. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what other secrets lie buried in Darien's past. This mystery shows us that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that the most horrific crimes can be committed by those who appear most normal to their communities. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the Eldorian hills? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of Darien history has many more secrets to reveal, and we'll be here to uncover them all. See you in the next video.